I work at a Antarctic facility, I make a lot of money. But some fucked up shit goes on here. Human experimentation, genetic editing, generally breaking the laws of nature. That type of stuff was the normal here. Most of my fellow workers were probably psychopaths, but working as a janitor here seemed pretty great. Sure, I had to clean after those horrors, but I was making as much as a CEO as head of the janitorial department here. But we really fucked up. A blizzard had whipped up that morning, so our tradition of running out nude had to be shut down. As I said about making sure the Wi-Fi was up and that each of my workers had a way to entertain themselves, a lanky scientist ran up to me. "My boss says he wants you to be at the viewing room 113, he said, out of breath. "Well, how many janitors do you boys need?" I asked. He replied quickly, "No, just you, Gus. We don't need a cleanup crew." It took about 5 minutes to get there. Viewing room 113 was all the way across the compound from where the living quarters were, but my high security clearance gave me access to the trams that went across the underground complex. It was odd, being called to watch an experiment. I had already expressed my general disdain for what went on here, and even contemplated being a whistleblower once or twice, so why would Steve, the head of R&D, have just me come through? I brushed away my confusion as me and the tall guy walked through the doors to viewing room 113. Steve Grotko, without turning, said, "You're gonna want to see this one, Gus. I figured out how to puncture the veil between reality and whatever else is out there." I looked around and saw the heads of the other department and bigwig scientists in the room. Then I asked, "So what's so important that you got all the head honchos here?" Steve was about to say something when Diane, the head of security, said, "Because this breakthrough could mean we find a whole multiverse out there. We'll be unstoppable in terms of military power. And what if there's nothing out there for us?" I shot back, "Shh, we're about to begin. Just watch." Steve interjected before we could debate any further. The machine started up, and bursts of colors I had never seen before flashed beautifully before my eyes. Then Diane's walkie began to chatter, "We need security, help us." And at least 30 variations of that came through. Everyone turned to her as she asked, "What the hell is the situation?" No replies came. A mechanic cried out, "Sir, we need to shut it off. It's overheating." Then there was a strange moment of silence. I felt like someone had chucked a flashbang at me as I got up. Most of the people by the indestructible glass had severe lacerations and everyone else was still out. Then I saw what was in the room Steve's machine had stood in. Body parts, corpses and all manner of unholy things stood in there. Some cried, some shouted, and even worse, some realized they could get through the remnants of the wall. I ran over to Diane's unconscious body and yanked the gun out of the holster. I shot the first thing that had crawled through. It was a perfect headshot. I was impressed with myself. Then it got up, and the other things heard. I took Diane's access card from her belt and ran. The halls were eerily empty as I ran through them, and fog had seeped in. A gas line must have broken in the explosion. Saving my own ass was my main priority at the moment, though. The fog cleared as I made it room 95 and had to do a double take. The glass had broken out of the door, and a chimpanzee was trying to claw its way out. The scientists working on it lay dead. I kept on running. Then I saw room 94. A plant had suddenly grown to hold the scientist working on it by the throat. Room 93 had flooded with water, and the fish in it looked to be eating the worker that was in there. I realized that every experiment in here had probably been sullied and turned on us when I got to room 85, and saw that mushrooms had exploded to cover every part of the room. What had Steve done? I eventually made it to the weapons locker room. I went in and grabbed a set of ballistic armor. It took a while to find a set that fit. Then I went to the weapons lockers. I used to be a Marine, and when I wasn't eating crayons I had become very familiar with a lot of these guns. I grabbed a M4, and a shotgun. After I had gotten a bag of ammunition and other things, I exited the room. I made sure there was nothing in the hallway. The things had most likely left room 113 by now, and it seemed every room with active experiments had become a threat too. There was on average 75 to 150 experiments on any given day, and at least 25 of those were on humans. When I left the hall I saw what looked like a furless dog prowling the halls. It turned and began to silently run at me. I shot it 5 times before it went down. For good measure I unloaded 4 more bullets before moving on. I realized as I rounded a corner away from the security hall that gunshots were loud, and anything that bore me ill will would be on its way. After running for a while I got to a fork in my path. I could go straight ahead, and get to the living quarters, or left and go to the hangar. I could probably accidentally wreck a helicopter by a more official station. I nearly went to get other people out when I saw what looked like a walking tree lumber across the end of the hall. It was already too late for them. I sighed as I realized it hadn't noticed me and turned left. Then I saw another one, 20 feet away from me. It was staring right at me. I began to back up, reach for my gun when it charged. I barely dodged, but whatever the fuck that was went through a wall. Then something grabbed me from above. I looked up to see a long, slender, yet strong arm pulling into the vents. I started bashing at the arm, but it didn't yield. I was too big to fit in the small vent opening, so it started trying to pull me through by smashing me into the ceiling forcefully. I dropped my M4 and I was about to black out when the tree thingy came back. I tried reaching for my shotgun to try and keep it off of me, but I just dropped it. I grabbed my pistol instead. My bullets did nothing to it. Then it grabbed my legs and pulled me down with such a force I heard a loud crack from the arm. Whatever the arm belonged to let out a ear-piercing screech, and the tree began to run back towards the experimentation wing. I beat on it endlessly. I tried shooting it, nothing happened. I decided before anything else fought over me I needed to get away. I reached for my back and found a grenade. I looked for somewhere to put it. It wasn't hard to find a crevice in its weird plates of armor, so I shoved my grenade into its back after pulling the pin. It blew up, and the thing dropped me and fell over. I started running as fast as I could, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I was back at the fork when I realized a chunk of that thing had cut me. I had a large gash in my thigh. If I didn't get it treated soon I would bleed out. I ran towards my way out. The hangar is sealed shut. Automatic protocol if there is a blizzard, unless a code red was called. It took every department head's access card to call that. I didn't get Steve's card. I'm at a desk in the flight operations office now. I think I bandaged my wound too late, and I've lost too much blood. I don't know if there are any other survivors, but I know when an investigation team comes next week I'll be good and dead. The devil is fashionable, far more so than I expected. I knew he wore a suit and tie, but after I summoned him I looked in awe at the good looks he wore. It took some time haggling and working, but I got a deal with the lavishly dressed man. I was going to be famous, and make it big. Satan would amplify my artistic talent and in exchange I would give away one child. Call me evil, it was a damn good deal. So with our terms written out Satan did a hair flip, adjusted his asket and was gone with the wind. For a month nothing happened, and I felt scammed. Until one night of drinking and one night stands later I woke up to find someone else at my desk. I nearly cold clocked the guy sitting at my computer writing away, when I realized it was me. I remembered the deal, and jumped for joy. I was gonna make it big, with another me to bounce ideas off of. I could do anything. Until he looked at me and asked, "Who the hell are you, and what are you doing in my house?" That question was the start of many things. The fake me called the police and kicked me out of my house. My face had changed overnight, and when I presented my identification, the fake me accused me of stealing it. I was arrested, and later that day, the fake me published a screenplay that went big, I mean an instant cult classic, while I sat in a cell. Satan, the fashionable ass he was, had cheated me on the deal. While the fake me sat and got stupid rich, I sat in jail. I started to mull over my plans for revenge. First I retried the ritual I used to get the deal. No dice, and I still sat in jail. I was imprisoned for a week before they found identification for me. The guy whose body I was in was named Brian Duman, but my name was Charles Idaho. When I tried explaining this to the social workers I was sent for a mental evaluation. When I insisted upon the truth I was doubted every step of the way. I told them personal details, my mother's name and what I studied. They told me this was all information posted to Charles' webpage. I knew that, I posted it there for fuck's sake. They told me to sign in then, but I forgot my password and the security question was different than what I said it as. I spent a year and a half in a mental hospital while the imposter lived it up. I sucked up and pretended to be Brian Duman. The fake me announced he was marrying his girlfriend of 5 years. But that wasn't right, I never had a girlfriend. I tried the ritual to summon Satan again and again, but I still got nothing. All the while that imposter lived a lie, but it's okay. I found my new address, and when I put my own face back on Satan will have to come back, I get the money and my deserved fame, and most importantly we can negotiate another deal. When I was a young man, I asked my grandfather what the scariest thing he ever saw was. My grandfather was in his 90s at the time, nearing death. I expected him to tell me some old war story I had already heard a million times, but instead he stuffed his pipe, reclined and said, "Well son, if you're willing to listen I'll tell you." I sat down, a bit surprised. My grandfather was always a quiet man, and the only time he ever really talked was about war, bills or art, and normally with my parents. He lit his pipe and a rank smell filled the room as the sativa burned. I started my iPhone's camera. Exhaling a massive puff of smoke, he began his story. "Well son, when I was a young boy in Northern California I was always in the woods. Always amongst the trees or climbing up a hill, swimming in the local pond. Things a boy could get up to then. I knew those woods like the back of my hand, probably better. You city slickers may not know this, but you know what you ought to do when there's a weird noise in the forest at night? You ignore it and go back to bed like a reasonable person. As well as I knew those forests, I knew never to be out past sunset. I followed that rule the same way my ma followed Jesus. When I reached 17 I moved out to the city though. San Francisco, picked up a city slicker lifestyle, a city slicker girlfriend and a city slicker job. I went off to war when the time came, and I survived the European theater. Ma passed while I was out at war, and my dad, your great-grandfather, decided that he ought to give me a place to settle with my wife out in the country, get back to my backwoods boy roots along with a nice forestry job. I know you're probably already impatient boy, but I want you to live this story the way I did. The land was a glorious 40 acres, right on the edge of the redwood forest. It was a good-sized house we had. Not big enough for all you, but just the right size for me and Darcy. There weren't too many other people around. My closest neighbor, Marcel, was a millionaire, and the next closest fellow was Jonathan, a Klansman type employed by Marcel. The first few weeks we lived there were scenic, perfect even. Then the noises started. Darcy, bless her soul, thought we ought to check it out, but I still knew the cardinal rule: go back to bed like a reasonable person. The redwoods were airy too, like standing in the halls of giants. I always felt off there, but the pay was good and the house was mine, so we stayed. In the third month of living there, I woke up to a fire burning in our front yard. I gave Darcy my shotgun and rushed to put the fire out. Your grandmother was a black woman and I am a white man. In the 40s that was big taboo, so at first I suspected Jonathan. Figured the bastard thought he would be clever and send us a message 1910 style. I decided to pay him a visit with big iron on my hip. Except when I went to pay him a visit I found his house half burned. I went from spitting angry to concerned about him. I knocked and knocked, but he didn't answer. I kicked down the door and inside looked barren. There was this static noise, it was truly soul-tearing. I fell to my knees and then it passed. Groaning, I got up and made my way through the back of the house, trying to ignore the awful smells it held. Jonathan was dangling for at least 2 weeks by the time I found him hanging. I came back with the police sometime later. The police out there weren't too concerned about any of it. Just got the body out of there and left. Said it was pure circumstance. There were 2 fires, same, it was pure circumstance I found that body. The next day as I was doing my daily work, I heard that same buzz again. I fell to the ground as it intensified. I thought I saw a figure walk past me, but I passed out. I woke up sometime later in Marcel's house. I wandered a bit, dazed and confused until I ran into a butler. The house was truly massive too son, like a small castle. My entire stay there was incredibly surreal, but dinner was the worst. Marcel himself didn't seem real. Dressed up in a white tux, a plastic smile and a monotone voice. His butler was too quiet, obedient. There was true fear in that man's eyes. His maid seemed a bit too meek. She spoke, but the way Marcel eyed her made me uncomfortable. I still had my gun, and my hand never left my hip once. Marcel looked at me like I was dinner, not the disturbingly bland meal in front of us. I left as soon as dinner was over and began looking for a different place to live. I bought a Thompson at that time, I was so paranoid. I still own that gun. I kept it in the kitchen. A week after meeting Marcel in person I heard that damn buzzing again in the middle of the night. I was so paranoid I broke that rule. I grabbed my Winchester from the bedside, worked the lever action and went outside. I heard rustling in the shrubbery nearby, and unloaded all 8 rounds into those bushes. I heard a man cry out, and I ran and grabbed my revolver. It might seem odd to you boy, but I was strapped down with guns after everything. Every room had at least one. Anyway, I went outside, revolver raised because I wasn't gonna be bothered to reload. And I found that butler in the bushes. He was begging and pleading for me to just shoot him. I was downright confused. Then the maid came out of the woodwork. I couldn't tell you word for word what they said, but the gist of it was Marcel was some sort of sadist good at holding folks hostage and tormenting them, and he drove old Jonathan to killing himself. It still seemed like they were holding something back. So I told them to take it to the police. I drove them to the station myself. I waited down the road a little ways, and walked into a little shop for a bite to eat. Outside an old man sat with a cup. "For a dime I'll offer you some wisdom," he said. I bit and tossed him a coin. I can remember that geezer's speech like it was just told to me. Fear thy neighbor friend. He's not natural, and beware the buzzing. After hearing a description of my situation, I decided to go check on my home invaders. They never even walked into the station. I drove home truly fearful, and was beyond relieved when everything was okay and my wife was sleeping. I was too scared to work, so I took the week off. I had about 10 grand in savings, and I started moving into a new house in a suburb. Everything was fine until the last day. Everything was out of the house, spare the living room furniture and the guns. I drove up after leaving Marcy alone and heard the buzzing again. I nearly wrecked my Ford. I cautiously walked in with my revolver. And there the bastard was, sitting on my couch. Whatever he said to Marcy had her pale with fear. He pulled a gun out himself when he saw me, pointing it right at Marcy's head. "We won't be needing your gun, old sport, we've got mine here," he said. I dropped my gun and kicked it across the floor. "How about you grab me some coffee, and then we can discuss terms of employment," he told me. It was the scariest thing in the world to me, knowing what he could do, having him in my house, holding a gun to my wife's head. The buzzing was a sort of background noise now. I noticed that the back door had been kicked down when I walked into the kitchen, the open doorway looking like an invite to freedom. But instead I opened the cupboard, and grabbed the Tommy gun. I always kept it loaded. The buzzing got louder, and I realized Marcel was getting up. I pivoted and saw him languidly walking towards me. His smug look of satisfaction turned to fear as he saw my gun, and I pumped him with 35 rounds of .32 ACP into his ass, and that white tux was a nice dark red in a few seconds. When the police got around to investigating it, they found 2 skeletons in a burned husk of a mansion. The tests they ran showed that it probably burned sometime in the 1890s. The police chalked it up to a sociopath pretending to be rich. I think that it's something else. He was quiet for a time, until I asked, "What do you think it was, Grandpa?" He took a long drag and replied, "I don't know, but the older I get the more often I hear that buzzing." "Are you scared, Grandpa?" I asked him. He took another drag and replied, "No, I killed the bastard once and I'll do it again." I asked a third, and final question, "Do you really think the buzzing is Marcel?" He stared at the wall for some time before chuckling and saying, "No, it must just be pure coincidence. Now go run along and play now." The recording ends there. My grandpa passed in 2011. Turns out he still owned that property, and my dad inherited it. We're taking a trip up there soon, but I digress. I found my old phone cleaning out my room and getting ready to move out. The story remains as scary as it was to younger me, but it has a new layer of fear, because when I watched the recording I noticed something. Throughout the entire video there is a tall, transparent man, wearing a tattered white tux and a plastic smile that doesn't hide his hate, standing behind my grandpa, as if waiting.